Well, thank you very much. And is it good morning or good afternoon? I suppose good afternoon by now. Good day is perhaps a way around that one. Thank you for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here. How many of you know the old Texan saying, if you see a turtle on top of a 10-foot pole, you sure as heck know she didn't get there by herself? And how true it is that as we go through this life and we struggle on as best we can along our chosen path, that we rely so heavily on others to make those steps. And as I've struggled up this pole, there have been so many other people who've helped. There have been in the field my students and the Tanzanian field staff. There have been so many friends, and I should say that I can't mention by name the friends of mine who've helped, who are in this room, because it would take all our allotted time. And I think every one of you knows how grateful I am to all of you. And the staff of the Jane Goodall Institute, Don Buford, the CEO, the trustees of the Jane Goodall Institute, Dan Phillips and Ron Marsilio, are in this room. But of all the people who've helped me, the one I'd like to most specifically thank is my mother. Because when I was that little girl hiding in the hen house, in fact, the family didn't know where I was, and they called the police, and the dusk was coming down. And my mother was out calling, and she saw this excited little girl covered in straw rushing towards the house with shining eyes. And she didn't, as so many mothers might, scold me and say, where had I been, and I'd better not dare do it again. Instead, she saw the excitement, and she sat down to listen to the story of how a chicken lays an egg. And she encouraged all these crazy dreams I had as a child. You know, imagine going back 50, 60 years, the world was very different. And by the time I was 8, 9 years old, my dream was to go to Africa. Why? Because I was in love with Tarzan and terribly jealous of Tarzan's Jane, and thought that I would have been a much better mate for Tarzan myself. Don't you think so? But all my mother's friends said, why don't you tell that child to dream about something she can achieve? Because we're going back to a time when it was the dark continent. Africa was something we thought of with poisoned arrows flying through the air and drums beating out sinister messages at night. And young girls didn't go tramping off into the wilderness to live with animals as they do today. And so it really did seem impossible, particularly as my family didn't have any money. But what my mother always said to me was, Jane, if you really want something and you work hard enough and you take advantage of opportunity and you never give up, you'll find a way. So it's history, how I got there, saved up my money, worked as a waitress, met the late Louis Leakey, that famous, incredible paleontologist, anthropologist, and how he gave me the opportunity to make my dream come true. And for the past 35 years, along with students and field staff, we've been learning ever more about these amazing closest relatives of ours, the chimpanzees. We're still learning after 35 years. And I think what strikes us most is how like us they are. We know today from biological research that we differ from them genetically in the composition of the DNA by only just over 1%. And this turns out to be very unfortunate for the chimpanzees, because some scientists believe that as a result of that similarity, they can be useful in finding out more about human diseases and searching for cures and vaccines, particularly things like hepatitis and AIDS, because chimpanzees can be infected with those otherwise uniquely human viruses. And there are similarities too in the structure of the blood and the immune response. But what's been so fascinating for me has been to learn these incredible similarities in behavior, the long childhood, the importance of learning in the individual's life, the close, supportive, affectionate bonds that develop between family members and some other individuals within a community, which can persist throughout a lifespan of more than 50 years. The fact that chimpanzees are capable of altruism. In their nonverbal communication patterns, they show gestures that we're so familiar with ourselves in human cultures around the world: kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting one another on the back, swaggering, tickling. Gestures and postures that occur in the same kind of context as we see them in human cultures, and clearly mean the same kind of thing. It's known today from observation in the wild and also in captive groups and some experimental work that chimpanzees are capable of intellectual performances that we used to think unique to ourselves. They can reason, they can solve simple problems in the same kind of way as we do. They can use and understand abstract symbols in their communication, as has been shown by the language acquisition experiments. They are capable of tremendous memory feats, and perhaps the most significant of all of us who've worked closely with chimpanzees over the years in a natural or semi-natural situation have absolutely no hesitation in affirming that they show emotions similar to or perhaps identical with those that we call joy and sorrow, fear and despair. And in all these ways then, chimpanzees are so like us. It's a little bit sad that many scientists for so long have rejected some of these similarities, very quick to seize on the biological, physiological similarities, and therefore maintain that chimpanzees can be useful to help us solve human medical problems. But once we take this a step further and start talking about similarities in the mind and in the emotions, then this becomes something which is not properly hard science. And I think the reason for this rejection is because of the use of chimpanzees and other animals in so many different ways. Now that we do know, well, when I began in 1960, and I went to Cambridge University in England, I could not have studied the chimpanzee mind because chimpanzees and other animals didn't have minds. That was uniquely human. I couldn't have studied adolescence because adolescence was a unique cycle in phase in the human life cycle, and animals didn't have adolescence. You couldn't talk about personality. That was unique to ourselves. And although science actually recognized that these things existed, they swept them under the carpet. And we were not allowed to study them or talk about things like that. I should have given the chimpanzees numbers instead of names. But fortunately, attitudes have changed since those days. And even this difficult subject of emotionality is now beginning to find its way into scientific study. The chimpanzees, I think, more than any other non-human animal, serve as a bridge between us and them. They are so like us in so many ways that sometimes we seem to see our own behavior or the behavior of our remote ancestors mirrored in chimpanzee behavior. And you see, once we're prepared to accept that it isn't, after all, only human beings who have personality, it isn't, after all, only human beings who are capable of rational thought, and above all, it isn't only human beings who are capable of knowing emotions like joy and sorrow and mental as well as physical suffering. That leads us to a new respect, I believe, not only to chimpanzees, but to so many of the other amazing non-human beings with whom we share this planet. And that leads also to many moral problems, ethical problems, which each one of us must face and decide how we're going to act for ourselves. The sort of ways that we use and abuse animals. Once you believe or admit that they have personality, rational thought, and emotions at varying levels according to the development of their brain, and then you start to think of what goes on around us. It's because of my increased understanding of the plight of chimpanzees around the world that instead of sitting, as I used to year after year, in the beautiful forests of Gombe, I'm traveling mostly around the world, talking to groups of people like yourselves, and particularly talking to young people. In America, in Europe, in parts of Asia, there are literally thousands of chimpanzees in tiny laboratory cages, measuring sometimes 5 foot by 5 foot and 7 foot high. And I think that my visits into some of these labs have been the worst that I've had to endure in understanding the plight that does face non-human animals today. And as I've said, they're there because their bodies are so like ours. But once we're prepared to believe that there is this emotional suffering, we treat them in a way that we wouldn't even treat our worst criminals today. And these chimpanzees are not only innocent of crime, but they perhaps are helping to alleviate human suffering. At least that is what people believe, although there's no consensus on this, even among the scientists working on these kind of problems. Chimpanzees, because they're cute when they're young, have been for many years kept as pets. Even today in the United States, it's perfectly legal to buy our closest living relative and take him or her into the house. And they can learn to do many of the things that a young human child learns. They can sit at table, eat with a knife and fork, look at television. They can be taught sign language, the ASL, the language used by the deaf. They can play with the dog in the garden, go out for rides in the car. They can even learn to identify lots of pictures in books. But what happens when that little member of your family reaches the age of 7 or 8? Suddenly they don't want to be children in a human house, human children in a human house. They're moving towards adolescence. The hormones are changing. They want freedom. They increasingly resent discipline. And they become, by the time they're 7 or 8, stronger than a normal human. So they're potentially dangerous. When disciplined, they may bite. So what are you going to do with this small person? Zoos don't want them. They don't know how to behave like chimpanzees. They're mentally crippled. And so many of these ex-pets end up in medical research laboratories. I've seen them there. From the luxury of being able to go to a drinks cabinet, open it and mix a gin and tonic into a 5-foot by 5-foot cage where they may remain for the rest of their lives. Chimpanzees have traditionally been used in entertainment, circuses, and various other forms of entertainment. It's becoming increasingly known today that when you train a chimpanzee to perform night after night stupid tricks, dressed up in inappropriate clothes, it's usually necessary, first of all, to ensure that that chimpanzee is fearful of the trainer, because otherwise he or she is not going to want to do things like that. And the traditional way of ensuring this obedience, this instant obedience on command, is to beat the young chimpanzee over the head with an iron bar, breaking the spirit. It's not only chimpanzees, it's elephants and other exotic animals used in circuses particularly, but other forms of entertainment as well. And as the young chimp gets older, the teeth are very often pulled, shock collars go under the clothes, and again, when they're too big and too dangerous for the circus, then they too are likely to end up in medical research. There are zoos, there are sanctuaries that care for them, but many of them end up in medical research. When we come to Africa, chimpanzees are disappearing so fast. They're disappearing because their forest habitat is being destroyed by the increasing human population explosion. They're disappearing because they're hunted. In some areas, females are hunted so that babies can be taken from them and sold, but that trade is lessening. And far more dangerous today is the bushmeat trade. And here, chimpanzees, gorillas, any kind of animal in the forest is being hunted for food. In the old days, the hunter would hunt for meat for his family, perhaps for the village. But today, the logging companies, the worst culprits, are making roads deeper and deeper into the heart of the last remaining great rainforest of the African continent. And with those roads comes opportunity for settlement along the sides of the road, and hunters. Deeper and deeper can they go into the forest. And when they've shot the animals, now they can put the bodies, dried, usually in the sun or by smoke, onto the logging trucks. And now the meat is taken into the town. So it's become not just subsistence hunting anymore, but a way of life, making money by killing the last of the animals and selling them as food in the markets of Central and parts of Western Africa, where bush meat is infinitely preferred to any kind of domestic meat, such as cows or goats. And these things together are making the situation for the remaining chimpanzees grim. They used to be present in their hundreds of thousands right across the broad equatorial forest belt from as far east as the western part of Tanzania, Uganda, and so forth, right across to the west coast. Well, there isn't an equatorial forest belt anymore. It's a series of fragmented remnants. And whereas chimpanzees are still present in reasonable numbers in the 4 central countries of their range, Congo, Zaire, Cameroon, and Gabon, everywhere else they're in these very tiny, isolated groups. In many cases, there are not enough of them for it to be genetically viable for their continued existence. And this, sadly, is true for my own precious Gombe National Park. Today, this tiny 30-square-mile area is home to about 150 chimpanzees in 3 different social groups. And where the forest stretched in an unbroken line along the shore of the lake when I got there in 1960, today, outside that little 30 square miles, is just cultivated land, and the trees have gone. They've completely gone. And the same situation is repeated across the rest of Africa. And as you all know, when you start deforestation in tropical countries, the soils are very fragile, quickly lose their fertility, and soil erosion starts in, particularly with overgrazing, and very soon, where it was lush and green, you have the creeping desert. Are the people stupid that they cut down the trees? Don't they know that there'll soon be a desert and they'll be faced with famine? It's only when you've been there and seen the crippling poverty of so many of these peasants that you realize that because they're struggling to survive today, they can't afford to worry about what's going to happen in 10 years. And if we care about survival of chimpanzees and other wildlife and the remains of the forest, it's no good just going to the president of a country and saying it would be very nice to have some legislation that would protect this piece of forest for the future. Most of these countries are poor. Even if they're not, they're usually slightly dishonest, the people up at the top in government. And if the government makes legislation that says the forest is not to be used any longer, there's no way of enforcing this, so that it becomes desperately necessary to involve the local people in any conservation attempts. What our little institute is trying to do in some parts of Africa, Tanzania and Congo in particular, is to try and address the problem of orphan chimpanzees whose mothers have been shot, mostly in the bushmeat trade, who've been confiscated by the government. We're trying to care for them, and at the same time we're trying to use them as ambassadors so that the local people can understand how amazing these chimpanzees are, to use them as the focus for conservation education so that the children living in those areas can learn something about the environment and the dangers of deforestation. Because although so many people say, how can you care about chimpanzees or other animals when there are so many human problems in these areas? We have to understand that you can't separate it out. The forest goes, the chimpanzees, gorillas, and other animals go, and eventually the human population will be faced with starvation. It becomes desperately important to try and balance some kind of program for voluntary population optimization, family planning, with child health care so that the women can expect the children they do have to live instead of expecting, as they do today, that most of them will die. We try to involve as many of the local people as we can in all our programs at Gombe. The Tanzanians from the surrounding villages are helping us to actually study the chimpanzees and use 8mm video cameras. We employ them in the Congo around our sanctuary for orphan chimps as keepers. We buy as much food as they can grow or collect. And we are trying to raise the money now to build a small dispensary and primary school so that the local villagers actually want us there, as well as developing some ecotourism. The Roots and Shoots program, which began in Tanzania, is really my contribution to the survival of the forests in the future. And not only that, but the survival of the wild wilderness as we know it today around the world. Roots creep under the ground to make a firm foundation. Shoots seem new and small, but to reach the light can break open brick walls. And we look on the brick walls as all the problems that we humans have inflicted on this poor old planet, from the deforestation, the spread of the desert, the predicted changes in global climate, the pollution, the famine, the disease, war, crime. Massive problems. Is there hope for the future? Yes, hundreds and thousands of roots and shoots around the world can break through. And Roots and Shoots involves children, as you heard already, in 30 different countries now, although it's only really strong in this country, Canada and Tanzania. It's growing in other countries. It involves children from kindergarten to college in hands-on projects that show concern and care for the environment, for animals, and for each other. And the type of program that the children are engaged in will depend on the imagination of the young people or the teachers and the exact problems that are going on their back doorstep, because this is about making the world around you a better place. You know, we do love to point fingers, don't we? These environmental problems, are they my fault? No, of course they're not. They're the fault of industry or scientists or anybody but me. But if we're thinking about industry and its pollution, who is buying the products and using the products of that industry? I am. We are. We suffer from what I call just meism. All of us, everyone in this room, I guarantee we don't go through a single day without doing something that we know is bad for the environment. Just a little thing, dropping a bit of trash, leaving a light burning, or we don't do something we know we should. But how can it possibly matter? Because there are millions of people in the world, and I'm just one little person, so what I do can't make any difference, can it? It's just me, and anyway, nobody knows. And all around the world, there are millions of people all thinking the same. If they think at all, it can't make any difference. It's just me. And anyway, nobody knows. Children, particularly small children, understand this a lot better, because a small child knows perfectly well that he or she is the center of the universe, and they know that what they do makes a difference. So if we can catch them small enough, therein, I believe, lies our hope for the future. Not only for the chimpanzees and the forests of Africa, but for so much of the wildlife and so many of the beautiful habitats that we've all grown up knowing. And I think any of us who care about the future for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, must really hope that those children of the future can grow up and see blue sky and trees and hear the birds singing. That's what we all hope, isn't it? Well, it's up to you and me. And that's what Roots and Shoots is all about. Thank you.